Edu Arctic2, Polar Research for Education, innovative program in Poland and Norway. Webinars.
Everything has disappeared, sorry for that. I'm gonna share my screen now. And ideally, we should start this. I hope everyone can see this. Maybe you could send me a short yes. Is that working? Perfect. Okay, then we're in business. Thank you very much for the feedback. I will try to follow the chat a bit, and Hilde, who's our host, will shout at me if you're welcome to ask questions anytime and interrupt me. It's just possible that I don't see it in the chat immediately. Okay, let's go. I'll just try to find a different laser pointer. Here we are. So now we're in business, I think. Okay, so we're going to talk about migration. And since we're dealing with the EDU-ARCTIC2 program, we're mostly going to focus on migration in the Arctic. And as you can see from this very, very rough overview map here, there are a lot of migration routes that lead to and from the Arctic. In red, you see the major bird migration routes, so via the air, so those can go the longest way, and then the slightly but still impressive shorter migration routes of cetaceans, so whales and pinnipeds. But of course, there are also terrestrial migrations on land, and those are by nature, of course, somewhat shorter, but still very impressive. And we will try to understand today why animals spend so much energy and effort into going one of the most inhospitable places on the earth, and that is the Arctic. So, oops, can't go on, it seems. Sorry, yeah, here we go. So we'll take a short look back into history. Migration is, of course, not a new phenomenon and has, of course, always been observed by humans. And one of the first great nature philosophers was Aristotle, and he had some very interesting ideas about migration. What he observed in winter was that the robins that breed further up in the UK, for example, everywhere in Europe, appear in Greece, and at the same time, this bird disappeared. So that's the redstart, also a migrant bird. So what he decided, what's going on, is that these species transmutate. So one species turns into the other to better cope with the harshness of the Greek winter. Nowadays, we know, of course, that a species cannot turn into another one. Another idea he had was that the animals hibernate, and that is, of course, something some animals do, but not as he thought, the swallows. So he gave very detailed descriptions about how the swallows disappear into the mud of the lakes and into the swamps. And without questioning this any further, this idea had been propagated over hundreds of years in natural scientific books and teachings. So on the bottom here, you see a cut from a book by the Swedish Archbishop Olaus Magnus, and he explained very clearly what you have to do when you have all these swallows that get caught in the nets together with the fish. And he proclaimed this, of course, with all the insurance of a man who's never seen this happening. But this was taught at universities over many hundreds of years. So what was really needed was a bit more information. So more and more interesting ideas came up. So this is the Barnacle goose, and this beautiful goose can be seen in Ireland, for example, for large parts of the year, but no one ever saw them nesting. So nobody knew where they nest or where these geese come from every year. And as people saw this stuff floating up on pieces of wood, they of course decided this is very, very similar to this goose, so it must be the same organism. And the idea that developed was that the barnacle goose springs forth from a tree that carries these barnacle fruit, and from those fruit, when they're ripe, the goose emerges and washes up on the shores of Ireland. And thus the goose has become the barnacle goose, and the barnacles have become the goose barnacles. So here we've got a right collection of crazy stories. What was really needed was a scientific approach. How can we find out how these animals engage with winter, what's happening, and what they needed for this, of course, is what we're doing nowadays, and that is to tag the animals, to find something to follow a single animal and see where it goes. And the first scientific tag on a migrating animal was used on a stork. This unfortunate individual was shot by an African spear. It did not die from it, so it didn't wound the animal to the point where the animal died. And despite of this horrific injury, the animal managed to migrate from Africa all the way to Germany, where it was then shot down and stuffed and now stands in a museum. So that was the Pfeilstorch von Mecklenburg, the sparrow, the arrow stork in Mecklenburg. And that was the first time, the first proof that the animals did not disappear into the swamps or turn into another species, but that they actually go somewhere else very far away. Nowadays, we've tagged all sorts of animals, from butterflies over jellyfish, fish, all sorts of birds, mammals, cetacean, marine mammals, and reindeer, all sorts of things. So nowadays we've got slightly better tags than this one that send their location to satellites and hopefully are less of a bother to the animals than this African arrow or spear, actually. But let us now look into the question, why do animals actually migrate to the Arctic? This nice species here, which you can hear in the background, is very vocal, and it's a long-tailed duck that can be found throughout the Arctic. And why do they migrate such a long way into a wilderness of snow and ice? Why is that the place they choose for breeding? And the answer to this long-tailed duck migration, and to all other migrations, is that although the Arctic is a harsh, cold, icy place for large parts of the year, it's amazingly rich in life in the Arctic spring and summer. So what happens is, as the Arctic summer comes into being, there is more and more light until we've got the Arctic summer, during which we've got the midnight sun. That means you have 24 hours of day length. And this amount of solar energy is actually more than you would get on the equator, where the sun might be hotter, but only there for 12 hours. So these 12 hours of light make the production of biological mass possible, of plants, but also in the sea, phytoplankton, and upon those plant organisms, all the other organisms feed. So as the temperature rises, as more and more sun energy is coming into the Arctic, there is an explosion of species. And here you can see as the temperature goes up, more and more bird species, this is just the number of bird species observed, comes into the Arctic to make use of this incredible richness in biomass to breed. So even though the Arctic is mostly very cold, it does offer an enormous amount of energy to all sorts of animals, and makes it worthwhile to go on a very long migration, on which they spend, of course, a lot of energy. So this is what we see in the Arctic spring. Of course, the animals find their territories, breed their youngsters, and then, of course, they have to fatten up again and leave the Arctic before the Arctic winter sets in. So then we're dealing with the autumn migration. And I've picked out another bird, the bar-tailed godwit, which does one of the most amazing migrations. And it's only been observed a few years ago, actually, that these relatively small animals could be equipped with a transmitter, and they brought a whole lot of new science to us that we, to that point, had not understood. This is what the bar-tailed godwit sounds like. Very nice sound, and nobody knew where they were migrating. No one ever saw them on their migration. They suddenly turned up in Australia and New Zealand, and they suddenly turned up in Alaska, but no one knew where their migration route went. And now we see that this relatively little bird does a non-stop migration from Alaska to New Zealand across the Pacific Ocean. And they fly this non-stop, obviously, because these birds cannot swim, so they have to stay in the air. Those that get too exhausted will disappear in the ocean. And they do this in about 8 days. Now, this was a stunning discovery because as a physiologist, I can tell you it's not possible. The bird cannot be anywhere near fat enough to carry enough energy to do this trip. So how does it work? What the birds do is they hang around on these breeding grounds in Alaska for days and days and days, and more birds come together and they practice flying together, and they wait and wait and wait until something that until recently we haven't really understood happens, and then suddenly they all take off. And what is it that makes them take off? They can sense the weather. And these birds have evolved to wait for a specific prevailing wind that blows them straight south. So they're really riding the storm to make it across the Pacific Ocean. And that has several advantages. There are no predators along that route. There is no infection, but of course it's a perilous, very dangerous route to take because there are no stopover sites. So if the wind does not go as predicted, if they get too tired, if anything happens, they will drown in the Pacific Ocean. On the way back in spring, they will take the more sensible and much longer route, which takes many weeks, along the Asian coastline, where they have lots and lots of stopover sites where they fatten up and eat all the time, so they're much less exposed to the elements. So this is an amazing migration, straight across the Pacific Ocean in autumn, and a long leisurely trip along the Asian coast in spring. One problem is, of course, that along this route, you're completely reliant on air currents, and this population has evolved to expect those winds, which at great probability are there at this time of year. But with climate change, of course, prevailing wind currents and also sea currents may change, which would, of course, be very bad news for these birds that have evolved and are genetically programmed to take this route at this time of the year. Another problem is, of course, that along the Asian coast, there is a lot of industrial development. So all the stopover sites here are endangered. And if the birds cannot stop and get enough food along this migration route, their migration, of course, will also fail. So there's a lot of dangerous stuff happening along their migration route. Let's look at another animal that turns up here in Tromsø in winter. This is a video cut from a kayak trip I did a few years ago. And you can see these animals appearing. There it goes. This is a humpback whale. And over here, there's an orca. So these humpback whales and the orcas appear in great numbers in Tromsø every few years. They also go further out in the last few years. And in the spring, they may go further north into Svalbard, but then they all return into the Caribbean. And the reason they come up here to Tromsø is, of course, and Svalbard, is that we have very cold waters that are extremely rich in fish, and which, of course, a lot of the people here feed, but also all the cetaceans. And in summer, or in the spring, they go into the warm waters. And I'll show you another snip first before we talk about this any further. So here's another animal that comes along with the humpback whales and hunts together with them. So those are orcas or killer whales, and they migrate alongside the humpback whales to feed on the herring that come into the fjords around Tromsø. What you could see was a male in the background with a very straight fin, and then a female that was closer to the kayak. So why do they not stay in these waters year round? The Arctic is very rich in fish all year round. Why do they take the trouble of going to the Caribbean? And the answer is, of course, to survive in the cold waters of the Arctic. Whales need a big layer of blubber or fat, but their calves are born without this layer of fat, so they need warm water in the first few months after being born, and then only later can travel into the colder waters. Here's another example of a marine mammal. This is southern seal elephant, so we're now talking about the Antarctic very briefly, but just to give you an example, this is a very nice migration route plotted by my friend Martin Bioff. So he equipped the seal elephants with this little satellite marker that measures not only position, but also how deep the animals dive. And you can see that the animals follow along the ice rim around the Antarctic. So they're basically in the same cold waters year round. They have lots of food there. So why do they migrate? Why do they move so far? And the answer for these animals is, of course, that they need to haul out every now and then to feed, to have their young ones. And the other one is they undergo a change in fur, a molt, so they have to shed off their old skin. And for this, they need something that isn't ice, but pebbly beaches on which they can roll around and scrub off all the itchy skin in order to be in better conditions again. Very briefly, we'll also talk about the terrestrial migration, and the longest terrestrial migration of any animal is performed by the reindeer. They travel about 1,200 kilometers a year. However, in most countries in North America and in the Fennoscandian Peninsula, these reindeer migrations are increasingly stopping up. They are stopped by a lack of pastures, not enough food for the animals, and industrialization. So lots of electricity lines, roads, urban developments that plainly block their routes, especially the wild reindeer are very skittish. They don't like to be anywhere near roads. Here in Norway, the herders move the smaller herds around between the coast and the mountain regions, and they're looking for quiet spots for the reindeer to have their calves. The calves are usually stillborn on snow and ice, which they're perfectly equipped to deal with. But what happens with the changing Arctic, with climate change, is that very often this isn't snow anymore, but pure ice, and there is rain. And that's one thing the reindeer calves cannot cope with, is if they get wet, their fur does not protect them against the cold. So for the first time in thousands of years, reindeer are actually dying from cold because the calves get wet So lots of problems for the reindeer as well. I'll quickly go back to talk about birds, simply because these are the longest migrations we know of. And this particular migration route from the Arctic to the Antarctic is possibly the longest of any animal, and you can find it in the Arctic tern. The Arctic tern is also an animal I see very commonly where I live. I'll just try and give you an idea of what they sound like. Sorry, I'm just looking for the sound to give you an idea. There we go. So this is what the Arctic tern sounds like, and this is what summer in northern Norway very much sounds like. They appear very suddenly, always in huge numbers. They look like fairies, but I always find they sound more like vomiting witches. So not such a nice sound. And they have their young ones. Sorry?
Copy. Sorry.
Yeah.
These bird sounds, I at least cannot hear them very well.
Oh.
I wonder if you're playing them from your phone, maybe you could place your phone to the microphone on your headset.
Can you hear that? Could you hear that?
Not very well. No. You cannot hear it very well.
Oh dear. I'll try once more.
Now at least I could hear it.
Yeah, sorry about that.
We could probably put it in the presentation as a audio file for the next time.
Yeah, we'll do that. Sorry about that. Seemed to work fine last time. Okay, then I won't bother sending more of the using more of those. Okay, so the Arctic tern has its young ones in the Arctic, and this is what a baby tern looks like. And then as soon as the Arctic summer is over, they actually are amongst the first birds that disappear, and they go to their overwintering grounds in the Antarctic. And that means that the Arctic tern pretty much lives in eternal spring. It's going through all the other seasons along the way, but the tern itself, when it is stationary, just knows spring and summer. And you can imagine how many problems they experience along the way. They have a lot of stopover sites, of course, and most of those are also endangered, not only by climate change, but also by industrialization. So a lot of their habitats are destroyed, even though their breeding grounds and their overwintering grounds are still, to a large degree, to what they have been in the past. But along their migration route, they experience a lot of problems. So what does it actually take to be in the right place at the right time, to find the right food for their young ones, to find the right food to fatten up for migration, and to find all the right food along the way? And those are mostly three things. First of all, it takes a biological clock. This strange graph you can see here is called an actogram. And what you can see is everything that's black means movement. So this is when the bird is hopping around. You can see while it's daylight, the white bar here, the bird is very active. As soon as you turn the light off, the bird stops and goes to sleep. So you can see this is a rather long day. So the bird thinks we're getting towards summer. It's soon time to migrate. And what the bird suddenly does, this is, by the way, a garden warbler. What the bird suddenly does is this: it changes its behavior and starts hopping around like crazy at night for a certain period of the year, and then it stops all by itself again. And this is the internal clock of the bird that sits in the brain that tells it now it's time to migrate. And this is a nocturnal migrant, so they fly at night. And the intensity of the movement at night and the duration actually defines how far the bird would go out in the wild. So the bird is genetically programmed to fly off at night at a certain time of the year for a certain duration of the year and at a specific intensity. So this is what these birds have evolved to do. Moreover, they also have in their genetic makeup the direction in which they should go. So not only do they know that they have to go south, but they also know, okay, across Europe, I need to go slightly southwest to make it to Gibraltar, which is the shortest cross over the Mediterranean. And then after that, I need to change my direction and go southeast to make it to the tip of South Africa. So even these directions are programmed in the birds, and they also have the genetic makeup that tells them at what point of the year they have to change direction to arrive in a certain location. So an amazingly fixed program that these birds have evolved. Now, the biological clock is not 100% correct. It carries you through times like this, but it sort of goes off a little bit across the years. And in order to keep it synchronized with the environment, to what's actually happening in the environment, it can be synchronized to day length. Now, the weather changes every year, and no year is like the last one, but the one constant information that tells us how far the year has progressed, what time of year it is day length, or photoperiod, as we say. And you can see here the change in day length for an Arctic position. So I think this is very much near Svalbard, probably. You can see in the Arctic winter, we have a polar night. The sun does not rise, and the sun returns, and very quickly the days get longer, less and less night, until we hit the Arctic summer, the time of the midnight sun, when the sun does not set. And then we reverse this into the polar night again. So the migrating animals and pretty much all animals that don't live exactly at the equator use this change in day length to synchronize their internal genetically programmed clock to the environment, to make sure the internal clock does not go off. Why all this bother? And that is, of course, because the birds, or all animals, have evolved to find certain conditions at a certain time of year. And in this particular case, I've chosen a flycatcher that times the arrival of its young ones perfectly to make sure just when the young ones arrive, just when there's a massive need for food, there are enough caterpillars around to feed the young ones. So this is a very close interplay between these three components. And now the day length doesn't change, of course, and the biological clock changes only over the course of many, many, many decades and thousands of years in evolution. But now with Arctic change, the environment, of course, changes massively. Suddenly the caterpillars are not there when the birds are programmed to have their young ones. Suddenly the weather in the stopover sites and the migration routes are not rich in food anymore and do not provide the food that the birds need to fatten up. Or you can also apply this, of course, to the whales or to terrestrial animals. Suddenly the dry, cold snow that the reindeer calves need to be born on is not there anymore, but instead the pastures are frozen under a sheet of ice, and they cannot access the grass, and it's raining onto the calves, and they cannot cope with the cold anymore. So climate change, in short, is very, very bad news for long-distance migrants, because the long-distance migrants not only have to cope with changes in their environment, in their breeding grounds or in their overwintering grounds, but also all the way along their migration routes. And the longer the migration is, the more problems they can encounter. So at every step of their life cycle, they can encounter new problems. So we have different rates of changes in temperature. In the Arctic, it's the most extreme. In other places, it's less extreme. Whereas in the Arctic, you may experience changes of temperature of up to 10 degrees. over the last few years. In other places of the Earth, it might just be 2 or 3 degrees. And that means, of course, that the whole food environment for the migrants changes at different rates, which is not something the animals have evolved to deal with. We have shorter and wetter winters in the Arctic, more snow, heavy snow, wet snow, and a lot of rain on snow events where it rains onto snow, then it freezes over again, and that locks the pastures and makes grass and the pastures inaccessible for grazing animals. We have warmer summers, the forests are moving more and more north, the whole vegetation is changing, which of course affects all the animals feeding on this vegetation. We have changes in the prevailing winds and possibly also in the ocean currents. The weather has become more unpredictable, so while certain populations of birds or whales have evolved to use certain sea currents or air currents to get through their migration, this is becoming more and more unpredictable. There are new parasites, there's new competition, new predators are coming, there are invasive species, so that brings a lot of problems along with it. And not least, we're dealing with habitat destruction through urbanization, industrialization, not only in the breeding grounds, but also where the birds overwinter or all along their migration in their stopover sites, which they need to be able to complete their migration successfully and be energetically in a good position to find a territory, to breed and to defend their territory and bring up their young ones. So overall, the genetic makeup and the static signal of the photoperiod lead to timing mismatches for the breeding, for the feeding, and for the migration. So overall, we expect that long-distance migrants will be the first species that suffer most from climate change. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention. And you're very welcome to ask questions. Best is if you write them in the chat, and I will try to answer them as best as I can. Okay, so some of you could hear the bird sounds. That's good. I will send some sound files later on. All right. While you might think about questions, I can offer a Kahoot if there is interest for that. Right. How long does it take to have these results? No, that's which results do you mean? I'm sorry. Can you maybe? We can't stop climate changes in a fast way. That is absolutely correct. And I think that is the sad truth of what we're dealing with at the moment. That climate change is happening at a really fast rate, and the animals have no time to evolve that quickly. And that's the long and short of it. And the long distance migrants are the most vulnerable ones in this. And of course, all animals in the Arctic will very likely be affected by this the most, because this is where we have the fastest rate of change. For more temperate species like garden warblers and flycatchers, for example, it may not be so dramatic in the short run, because we have a very good genetic variation in the population, and some studies point towards the idea that some species at least can actually adapt to lay their eggs earlier or to go on a migration earlier within 2 or 3 generations, which is a time that could actually save populations. But not all species are likely have got the same amount of plasticity in their genetic makeup, and the further north or south you go, the more closely their breeding or migration is timed to the very short time span that's available in the Arctic summer, the less likely it is they will adapt. Is it safe to go near orcas by a kayak? Well, I must say I was very nervous, and of course a humpback whale, a kayak is nothing. They could flick the boat with the tip of their tail, probably without even noticing it. So far there haven't been any accidents here, and a lot of people do it here, and there are even a lot of people who go diving with the orcas. Personally, apart from the fact that it's too cold for my taste, I would not go there in the same way that I wouldn't try to sit with a pack of lions that's feeding. The idea is that the orcas are specialized on herring, but orcas have been known to kill people, although not in the area here. I think they are too focused on getting the fish while they're here, and at least so far there haven't been any accidents, but personally I'm not very keen to try it myself. Fortunately, even in Norway now, there are more and more restrictions of trying to not get too close to the animals, so the diving with orcas may well soon be out of the tourist scene again, which I personally think is a good idea. Any other questions? If not, we can try the Kahoot.
Watch other recordings from webinars on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/EduArctic. Edu-Arctic2, from polar research to scientific passion, innovative nature education in Poland and Norway receives a grant of 240,000 euros received from Iceland, Liechtenstein and Norway under EEA funds.